If you've been to Disney World recently, you may notice there's quite a bit happening behind the scenes.
Chopper 2 is giving us a bird's eye view of all the construction underway, including the transformation of Animal Kingdom. Only from Chopper 2, 11 acres of Animal Kingdom's biggest expansion ever is in full view.
I really think that the Tropical Americas is Disney's way of being like, we're going to move fast.
The more than $1 billion project replaces Dinoland USA with the fictional village from Encanto, including the first ever Encanto ride and the Esperanza character carousel.
We have what look to be like mountains being formed on top of the roof for the future Encanto ride.
Nearby, the Casita is going up, and the old dinosaur ride is starting to transform into an Indiana Jones adventure through a Maya temple. This all opens in 2027. Meanwhile, it's not hard to notice Magic Kingdom's construction from the ground.
Everything behind me, that's wall, 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 wall.
With Rivers of America and Tom Sawyer Island gone, Chopper 2 spotted retaining walls for a massive new ride track for the Cars-themed land Piston Peak. And behind it, what will be the Villains Land.
They also updated Big Thunder Mountain, and that just opened up a few months ago. And when you're riding on that, you can see the construction for the Villains Land.
And don't forget about Hollywood Studios, where Monstropolis is taking shape.
We can see the track going into the Monsters, Inc. door coaster happening behind Monstropolis. This area used to be the Muppet Vision area, but it's being built out, expanding the park.
That area is set to open around 2028. Lastly, Chopper 2 spotted the 1,000-room DVC resort, Disney's Lakeshore Lodge.
This massive new hotel being built over by Fort Wilderness is interesting because it actually has like a lazy river and splash pads and a really interesting pool.
Still a year to go until you can check in, set to open in 2027. Needless to say, a lot happening. Also at Magic Kingdom, by the way, the Carousel of Progress is getting an update with all new sets. And while most of the expansion at Magic Kingdom is dirt right now, the expansion is so large, the company has confirmed they will also be getting another ferry, too. Lots to come.